Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Ryan Smith and my partner is Ivan Rupnik. Ivan.
Hi, everybody. Welcome.
This is ModX Canada. It's a webinar. We do these webinars to reach out and connect with folks who are interested in modular construction, offsite and industrialized methods of construction. ModX is an advocacy and research, advisory and education organization. We'll talk about that. So go ahead and go to the next slide if you would. The agenda today, we'll do this over an hour and a half, 90 minutes. We'll do some introductions, then have a summary of the panelists' presentations that were posted on YouTube, and we sent you a link to that. You can also look at those afterwards. They're on the ModX website as well. You can get to them there. The respondents that we've invited will then offer some comments on what they heard from those presentations or watched from those presentations and some of the summary that Ivan and I provide. And then afterwards, the audience, you that are on the call can ask some questions. You can also do that during the actual events today. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button and you can click on that and type in questions. And Ivan and I will try and moderate those, group those together into light questions so we can answer as many or ask as many as possible to our panelists and respondents. Thanks, Ivan. Keep going. Again, we are ModX, Industrialized Construction, three-pronged approach: advisory, which is our consulting arm, research consulting arm. Ivan and I, in our day jobs, as well as doing ModX, are architecture professors at Research One universities. I'm at Washington State University, and Ivan is at Northeastern University on opposite sides of the United States. We also do exchanges, which we will talk about. Those are knowledge exchanges, basically tours and trips in which we exchange knowledge with leaders in the offsite industry, and then education, going out and training and educating and building skills in the AEC sector so that knowledge can grow and how to apply these lessons to construction. Go ahead.
Well, thanks, Ryan. Just a quick intro. Why are we here, and what are we all interested in? So ModX, as Ryan mentioned, is we're a research group. We're also involved in organizing exchanges and what we call EDUs, or sort of executive education offerings. And one of our big interests is in sort of de-siloing the offsite and affordable housing sectors, starting to look at what we call the ecologies of offsite manufacturers and the ecologies of affordable housing. So one way we do that is by identifying hotspots across the world, some that we visited in person, like Japan, the Northeast and the Northwest of the US, and other places we've had to visit virtually because of COVID, Sweden and the UK, and places we will hopefully visit soon that we have relationships with, like the Middle East and LATAM, or Latin America. So again, we've also, you'll hear that from some of our respondents, we've worked with regions in the US so far, and we'd love to work with other regions in the Midwest with Marty Tingerthal's group, Construction Revolution, as well as in the Northwest in Ryan's backyard with Marty Kooistra, who's also on the call. Again, as ways to both understand what we call these ecologies and move the offsite industry forward, but also move the built environment forward more importantly. And so again, today we're going to be focusing on Canada, but we'll also at the end give you a little bit of a preview of an upcoming event that will be virtual and eventually will be live in California as well. So again, just mapping out some of these regions that we've been studying on one of these useful McKinsey charts, where areas where, no surprise, offsite has grown at least in interest, if not in always adoption, areas where construction labor rate is high, as well as housing rate is high. And many of the places we've studied, including Canada, map high in both of those criteria. And again, we're also, this is part of this discussion. It is sort of a US centric as well as a global centric discussion about what public initiatives have shaped and will continue to shape the regulatory framework for housing in general, and particularly for the offsite sector. So one thing we've studied as academics and also as consultants is the outsized impact of public programs like Operation Breakthrough in the US, which both created the manufactured housing industry, but has also directly impacted modular housing. So how do those national programs play out? we've been trying to develop a comparative model for comparing across different regions, different ecologies, different contexts, despite of all of the differences that we see in places like Canada or Japan. We see a lot of common best practices. So here, one of our colleagues, Professor Shuichi Matsumura, explains the way that modular is inspected and improved in places like Japan, and how that was informed by things that were done in the US and elsewhere. Another question that we're going to be asking today, and we've asked in other events, is what is the right scale of offsite initiatives? We've seen in the US significant success at the municipal scale. For example, here we're chatting with the Mod Squad from New York City about one of their pilot projects. We've also seen real success in places like Minnesota with Mary Tingerthal's efforts. And we're also, again, seeing a renewed interest at the national scale about what kinds of regulatory and other kinds of changes we might see in order to increase housing supply. So that's something we're going to be talking about today. And also what we're interested in is how do we support, we're asking a lot of the offsite sector to provide higher quality, faster and more affordable projects for the housing sector. But we also know, and this is borrowed again from McKinsey's 2019 report, which we were also involved in, Ryan and myself. We know that like any manufacturing or any industry, there's a need for sort of constant demand to really achieve that economies of scale. So how do we sustainably grow capacity, capability, and competence? And this is something also the guests today from the industry side of Canada are going to be giving us a little bit of sense of how these public initiatives have impacted or positively impacted those 3 Cs in Canada. So anyway, I'm gonna give this back to Ryan, where he's going to start to introduce our panelists and respondents.
Great, and thank you, Ivan. These are our panelists that pre-recorded interviews that Ivan had with them. Again, they're available on YouTube, our channel. There are also links on our website, modex.network. And then we've invited some respondents from the United States in particular to talk about the context in the US and how this might apply to our context, some of these lessons. So maybe just 2-3 sentences from each of our panelists and respondents so they can introduce themselves. And again, I thank them for taking the time and joining us today. Let's go in the order they appear, left to right, top to bottom here on the screen, if that's okay. We'll start with Reese.
Hey, thanks Ryan, thanks Ivan. Pleasure to be here. So I'm Reese Kane, a sales director here with NRB Modular, part of the Dexterra Group, one of the largest modular companies in Canada, and have been involved with some of the programs that some of the other panelists have been talking about today. So happy to be here, and Ivan called me a modular geek. I'm happy to be one.
Yeah, I guess I'll go next. Craig Mitchell. I'm the principal of Black Box Offsite Solutions, so independent consultancy. But like Reese, I've been in the modular construction business here in Canada for over 25 years with various manufacturers, and have done projects in the west coast of US to Western Canada as well. And I know a lot of our guests here on this panel as well. And yeah, again, thanks to Ryan and Ivan for putting this together, because I really believe this is a really important topic for the modular business here as well. So thanks, guys. I guess over to Abi.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Abi Bond. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Secretariat here in the City of Toronto. And we are very focused, or pushed into being more aggressive around a supportive housing program in Toronto, partly because of the pandemic and the explosion in homelessness that we were seeing. And modular is a big part of that. It's not the only part, but it's a significant part of an accelerated delivery of new homes. So happy to be here.
Good day, everyone. James Forsyth. I'm the Director of Regional Development at BC Housing. We're a Crown-owned corporation, basically owned by our province or state, that's responsible for supporting the development of housing, anything from homelessness right through to affordable home ownership and everything in between. We support the nonprofit sectors, co-op sectors, and the private sector, and provide them with funding and financing. And then we also do our own direct delivery projects as well, including quite a bit of modular.
Hi, I'm Ryan Bigelow, the CEO of the Vancouver Affordable Housing Agency. And I we're responsible for managing the city's portfolio of non-market housing assets in the city of Vancouver. And yeah, really happy to share our experiences with the various modular programs that we have been partnering with BC Housing and others. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mike Blanford. I'm a research engineer at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Predominantly, I am the program manager for HUD's efforts conducting research on construction and housing technologies. As Ivan had mentioned, HUD has been in the offsite construction business for a long time, since the early 1970s. My background doesn't go quite that far, but have been heavily involved in the manufactured housing part of HUD, conducting research for them. And then more recently, our focus is turned towards modular housing. They're happy to be here.
Greetings, everyone. Marty Kooistra. I'm the Executive Director for the Housing Development Consortium, Seattle, King County. We're a 200 organizations, member organization focused on affordable housing issues in Seattle and King County. Many of you are aware, one of the hot markets in the country where we have a desperate shortage and crisis around affordable housing of all types. And so our members range from public funders and lenders to developers, for-profit and nonprofit architects, engineers, and service providers. Happy to be here. I think great lineup. Modular has been a big part of our conversation. We'll talk more about the challenges that we faced on the multifamily side here. Of course, I spent 24 years of my life before this job working for Habitat for Humanity, and certainly utilized modular as a big part of our response post-Katrina.
Thanks, and I'm Mary Tingerthal, and until 2019, I worked full-time in the housing finance industry in many different roles, but the last 8 years, I led the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, which is the agency in Minnesota responsible for providing various kinds of finance for affordable multifamily housing, as well as single-family mortgages. When I left that job in 2019, I founded something called the Construction Revolution, where we're a group of people that want to know more about modular construction and promote more modular construction, particularly commercial modular for multifamily in the Midwest. And I have had the great opportunity to work with ModX on a couple of projects. And I'm really glad to be here and excited to have the conversation.
Thank you again to our panelists and respondents for your time and being here. Go ahead, Ivan.
Well, so now, as Ryan and I are both professors, we're going to make sure that everybody did their homework. But there's not a quiz. So we will give you a little bit of a cheat sheet. What we've done is, as Ryan mentioned, is we've recorded kind of pointed interviews with all of our panelists. And some of you hopefully watched them before the webinar, but the good news is you can also catch up and get to know more about these initiatives after the webinar. But here, really, we wanted to give you an overview and the kind of structure, the decisions about how we, who we spoke to and why. As Ryan mentioned, actually probably around 2017, we've been following the Canadian Rapid Housing Initiative, something we really came relatively quickly from our perspective. Certainly it's been worked on for a while and seemed to have a big impact. So we asked James Forsyth from BC Housing, really looking at British Columbia, where a lot of these initiatives started, to give us an overview of how those initiatives began, how they were structured, and how has also the sort of BC Housing Initiative impacted initiatives at the city level, particularly in Vancouver, and as we'll discuss, how it's also translated to other parts of Canada, other provinces and other municipalities. And we'll talk more about that again as we get into the discussion. Then we move on to Ryan Bigelow. So looking from, again, the province to the municipality scale, the scale of these initiatives is something we're very interested in. And Ryan really spoke about how the role of modular housing within what in Vancouver they refer to the right supply of housing, particularly the role of the city of Vancouver, in using city-owned land and combining that city-owned land with rapid modular construction. And again, looking at a theme you'll see throughout the kind of schedule and the tactics as well as strategy of these initiatives. So again, how the BC at the sort of provincial scale and now how Vancouver at the city scale rolled out the project, really starting with the terminal, with the 2020 terminal as a pilot project, moving on to temporary modular housing projects, and then expanding more recently for a shift from temporary housing and addressing immediate issues to long-term housing, permanent modular housing. We also would love to hear more, and we'll, hopefully, I know something we were hoping to discuss in more detail is the short program, really looking at the sort of expediting of permitting and licensing in general for affordable housing, but particularly for modular. So that's something you can learn more about if you haven't already from Ryan's. And then last but not least, Abi Bond, who actually was involved in was a key player in the Vancouver sort of programs, has brought a lot of that knowledge over to the City of Toronto. So again, knowledge exchange and transfer. We're big fans of it, ModX, understanding how those mechanisms work and really looking at the shift from shelter housing to supportive housing and the role that modular has played there. And so even the really more of the strategy being how those strategies have shifted, even the costs associated with those strategies. We really appreciated one of Abi's key concepts that this was part of the strategy for both a rapid but also a dignified response to homelessness. Something we really appreciated, and again giving a sense of how after British Columbia and Vancouver being a kind of the beginnings of these initiatives, how the City of Toronto has now taken on these tactics, transformed them for a different context, different city, different parameters, and what is a pretty significant commitment to modular and generally affordable housing. And then what we'll also talk about maybe is something that many regions are running into is, and we've noticed, is that sometimes we're able to advocate more quickly for the advantage of the modular housing than the industry is able to scale up. This is something we ran into when we worked more broadly with the Modular Building Institute and in their interests from the industry perspective about increasing demand and then rapidly figuring out that increasing the 3 C's, capacity, capability, and competence, is a real challenge for the industry. And so that's something that's a general topic, and we've seen that challenge throughout the globe, and it's familiar in the US and Canada. Pass my baton to Ryan.
We also spoke with two that have a deep manufacturing project delivery experience. So Kane, who introduced himself, and Craig Mitchell. When we spoke with Reese in that interview some while ago, he spoke about the supportive housing programs that these cities and province that Ivan has reviewed and summarized, how that impacted them as a company, and in many ways, justified sort of an expansion of Dexterra Group into acquisition and NRB and having capacity in serving housing, sort of an interesting model of horizontal integration as a business. Relocatable temporary foundations was an interesting conversation with Reese, and if you go to that video, it's pretty fascinating to see the application from the permafrost soils up in the north of Canada being used for temporary modular construction down near the border of the U.S. And it's a really interesting technology that I think could have wide application. Talked about optimizing the process for 4 to 6 months schedule from conception to occupancy. I mean, that's an incredible schedule for any construction project to be able to deliver on. And then this required a development of a standard product platform that could be implemented across numerous sites. So there was no kind of going back to the drawing board and having to make something bespoke and custom every time. That reduced reset time at every stage of the delivery process. And then finally, because it's modular and because it's fast, it did present some challenges and something to think through, but also opportunities with regards to the community engagement process and trying to get buy-in from the community, in particular from the benefit side, using a modular prototype to bring out to the site and allowing the community to see it, touch it, feel it, and get familiar with it so that they're much more accepting of this in their backyard. Keep going, Ivan. Craig Mitchell from Black Box Offsite Solutions, a consultancy company, 24 years of modular, as he said, with the kind of the last decade really deep in modular multifamily housing and high performance housing. One of the things that Craig talked about were some lessons that he's learned over that 24 years and what can we take forward into the future to address affordable housing. And one thing that he rose to the top that Ivan's touched on is the capability and knowledge of the manufacturers are necessarily evolving in this new market as the demand shifts to housing. So a lot of these manufacturers, particularly in Canada, used to and still do manufacture workforce camps, workman camps, or things for the oil and gas industry, or even relocatables. And so how do you transition that manufacturing capacity into something that's under a different code and a different type of spec is something that everyone is facing, both in Canada and the US. Modular needs to be fit for purpose. It's not excellent for all building types, but it certainly is a good match for housing. Is something Craig talked about. And clear and detailed contracts are necessary for scope of work delineations. We continue to see issues in that, and he has over the last decade. And then workflow delays occur at the communication gaps between the factory and the site. And that continues to happen. So those are some things that Craig brought up from his experiences. Keep going, Ivan. So I think at this point, what we'd like to do is see if there's any clarification, first of all, from our panelists in what we said. Did we cover those topics well, or do you want to add to this before we get into some of the respondents' questions related to some of your presentations and what the Canadian programs present? So we'll start with the panelists. We'll go left to right. Anything we did not cover that you think should be highlighted? Reese.
No, I think you covered it really well, Ryan. We're so excited to be here today. I'm obviously on the manufacturing side, and these sorts of programs really enable the sort of the scale and the consistency of the work to start to grow and build the business. One of the things you mentioned was sort of lack of capacity, and that's absolutely correct. That without the modular industry sort of stepping up and providing the capacity and resources, then those investment in these programs is not going to happen. So that needs to follow and has done in the East for us. So otherwise, I think you covered it really well.
Craig.
Yeah, no, I think covered it well. I think the only thing I would add is one of the things that we look at as well is obviously we talk a lot about the building itself, and sometimes we neglect to talk about, is the owner right for adopting modular as well. And so pre-qualification of the owner and the commitment, I think, is sometimes what we see lacking, is that do they have the commitment to dive into a modular project? That this is a long-term commitment, and it isn't often. Sometimes owners lose sight of it and say, I'm just going to try one project and then throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's definitely an evolution. And so that commitment to go and undertake a program is sometimes lacking. And I think, amongst BC Housing and Vancouver and Toronto, that's why it's been successful, is that there's this long-term commitment to adopt modular as part of a solution. And so that's often what we find is lacking. So,
Abi.
The only thing I would add is that speed around manufacturing and construction is not really enough on its own unless it's matched with the speed of approvals and also funding. So for us, the construction manufacturing part is one important part, but I think we also as a municipality have a role to play in the approval times, and also certainly rely on other levels of government to provide the funding necessary to deliver these kinds of homes so quickly.
And I think to Abby's point, we have two great examples in the world that one of the biggest cost savings in the HUD code program in the US is not just the manufacturing side, it's that there is a streamlined permitting and regulatory framework. And actually the entire country of Japan has used that program, not just to apply to a particular segment, but to all of Offsite. And that's something that both Canada and the US could work on and expand. This would be a great conversation to have. Just in what we found, again, in places like Japan, is that the industry advocated for changing the regulatory framework by making the argument that factory-made construction is actually easier and faster to inspect, not just direct. And that's something we need to understand better on both sides of the border in North America. But that's a great topic to unpack.
James.
Yeah, great summary. I think the only other thing that I would add is just around just ensuring that you're creating a good alignment with your construction methodologies to your actual housing outcomes that you're looking for, and working from that goal and then backwards is always key. Thanks.
And Ryan.
Yeah, agree. Great summary. And yeah, to add to some of the points is approaching our housing crisis we need to take a multi-pronged approach, and modular is a part of that. And there is a right fit. It's not the only solution, but I think it is a very impactful one. So, thanks.
Right. Thank you, Ryan. Good. I think at this point, we'd like to invite our respondents to either ask questions or comment, or both, on what these presenters have offered to us, these panelists. And I think we'll do it in the same order, if that's okay, from left to right. Mike, Marty, and then Mary, 3 M's. Mike, go right ahead.
So Ryan, do you want me to ask all my questions, or just one and then pass it down?
That's a great point. And Mike, why don't you ask your most pressing question? We'll go down the line, then we'll repeat. That sounds great if we have the time.
All right. So one thing that I heard in watching the videos has to do with the temporary modular multi-story housing. I hadn't really seen that before. And I was wondering, for either Ryan or Reese, or perhaps both, what special construction considerations are there for that type of, to make a box that is meant to be erected and then at some point disassembled?
Reese, yeah, go ahead, and then anyone else to answer that. Go ahead, Reese.
Yeah, so the program came out with the Terminal Avenue pilot that Ryan talked about, and the pilot program talked about how they wanted a relocatable system. So Horizon North at the time had used this foundation system multiple times for northern projects, and felt it was a good opportunity because you don't then have a sunk cost in your foundation too, because you could put a permanent foundation in that then would be got rid of, sort of thing. So essentially the nature of the building, the way it's put together, means that it can be relocated in the future. This is not a technology that's designed to be moved every year or so. It's a more of a longer term, short term program, if that makes sense. But essentially, I think, answering your question, Mike, it needs to meet all permanent building code. So it met all of the normal permanent building code that it would need to meet as if it was a permanent building. It just happens to be able to be relocated in the future. So it sort of shows the flexibility that modular can offer.
Also, just wanted to add, the height's also quite important, because once you start getting much higher than that 3 or 4 story, you start to introduce the need for elevators. You start triggering fire and code issues that all kind of change the profile of the project. So getting to that right height worked really well for us.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, let's go to Marty. Marty.
Yeah, well, I'll just pick up right where we left off. So great videos, by the way, and great presentations. Always exciting stuff. One of the things we're challenged here with and trying to fight our way through in the culture here is, when we start to look at our 502 product in the urban core of Seattle, the complexities of that construction in this wet weather climate have not yielded some successful demonstration projects. I'll just leave it at that. There's lower and sour taste. And when I look at a lot of the projects that we saw in the videos, flat sites, or appear to be flat sites, and with some open space. And we've kind of been thinking more about less the urban core and looking more at the suburban and peripheral markets for the 3 stories as being a way to start to get uptake. I just wanted folks' reaction to that.
Maybe the 3 housing planning and policy people, Abi, you know, Abi, James, and Ryan answer that question if we could.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a need to think about, and I think James mentioned this, think about the form, the type of manufacturing that you're using compared to both who's going to live there and where you're looking to locate that in the city. I would say that from the Toronto experience, we're actually actively, we have a number of sites. Ours are all permanent, so they're all going in on you know, permanent footings, concrete footings, and we have a couple of sites which are up to 5.5 stories now, and in fact one site that we're trialing with more of a steel frame. So we're definitely in a kind of an active mode of trialing to do modular housing, but in more of a urban setting than just keeping to the 3 stories for locations in the city where that's appropriate. So we've definitely been pushing the boundaries of what's possible around modular. It creates even more complexity in terms of your construction, your site itself, but it does mean that there might be more sites that are available to us if we have a bit more of a range of options from the construction side. So very interesting moment as we trial some of those things.
Yeah, I think to add to that, when we implemented that temporary or the rapid response to homelessness and those temporary modular housing projects, one of our priorities was being able to deliver them, you know, as fast as possible. So of course, a nice flat site is perfect for that. We are now looking at some more longer term housing projects where, you know, we're giving ourselves the time to say, well, how can we find a better way to be able to interface with the topography of the sites? Maybe that means there's a bit more in situ construction that takes place. Maybe we're getting more creative with our foundation systems or some of the kind of pre-construction grading that we're doing. But I think that really came down to those priorities for those projects, and yeah, we're trying to figure it out as well, because I think there's some fantastic benefits that if we can use a site that, you know, maybe has a couple stories of grade across it for modular and get those sort of successes that we've seen before, then you've got some really good solutions to put together.
I'd also just add in an urban setting, yeah, finding flat, square or rectangular sites that work really well for modular is a challenge. And also when thinking about bigger buildings or having a smaller sort of 3-story building, if you're thinking of relocating such a temporary building into a permanent configuration within an urban environment, finding land that utilizes that density will be a challenge in the future. So are you continuing to relocate your temporary building, or are you eventually going to permanently locate such a building? Will be a challenge to contain that just within an urban setting. We've also had to think about a lot of rainwater management and investment in the land, but also not necessarily trying to touch the land as much, because in an urban setting, sometimes you're dealing with a little bit more environmental contamination of the dirt. And if you're thinking of a temporary building and to keep your costs contained, you've got to balance, you know, how much investment you put on the site versus not.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks for those responses, Abi and James. Let's go to, and thanks for the question, Marty, it's good. Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to stick with this temporary housing notion for just a minute, because like Mike, it was a completely new concept to me. And I guess what I'd like to ask Ryan and James is, you know, if you had to do over again, if you were designing the perfect rollout of modular construction for multifamily, would you do this temporary housing approach, or was it, you know, kind of a stopgap because you had to get the housing built quickly? Is it actually a useful step? I don't know. I'm just not used to the idea of sort of not throwing away a housing development, but moving it to another place or reusing it. And I just wondered, is that something you really think should be an ongoing feature, or was it expedient and helpful at the time?
Great. Maybe I think all three of those that just answered probably have familiarity with that program, but let's maybe go to Ryan Bigelow. That's okay. You could answer that. Has it played out? I mean, have you seen that benefit yet, or it hasn't been moved yet, so we don't know how it's going to?
Yeah, we're in the throes of planning those initial moves with BC Housing. So there are obviously a lot of complexities to that, but you know, our initial pilot and the program with TMH got people into housing, you know, multiple years earlier than waiting for permanent development to occur. So if you think of the economic impact of that compared to the cost of relocating a building again, it probably makes a good business case there, right? So I'd say, yeah, I think we would continue to look at opportunities to utilize land temporarily while long-term development sites are being planned, because otherwise it's just sitting there idle, and the economic and social impacts are huge by speeding that up early. Some learnings I would think about are trying to secure your relocation pricing up front while you're doing your initial development of that project, so that, you know, in 5 or 10 years, depending on your relocation timeframe, you have more certainty of what those costs will be to your program down the road.
Anyone else want to answer? Yeah, James?
Sure. I remember when we were actually implementing this program, kind of our first jokes was, well, it's a government program, so you know, temporary really means permanent, right? You know, there's nothing more temporary than a permanent solution. So I think there's some huge benefits there, and we tried to design that, you know, into the buildings and the modules, and create you know, interchangeable kit of parts essentially, right? So I think from our perspective, we have a bit of a benefit, because not only could we relocate these buildings within one municipality, but throughout our entire province. And so, for example, over this summer with the wildfires in BC, we had the township of Lytton literally wiped off the face of the earth. And so with these temporary modular projects potentially coming up and being able to relocate, we now have inventory that we can potentially play with and redeploy elsewhere. So being able to do it within a city, I think is good, especially if you're trying to kind of future-proof those units that you've designed. So you could take that 3-story building, mix and match parts, maybe add an elevator to it. Now you've got a 4 or 5-story. Or if we need to be able to, you know, take those built units and redeploy them somewhere in response to a crisis like in Lytton, I think we have that, you know, that option now as well.
Maybe just to riff off that, right? Like if the first stay of that building is, say, in an urban setting, creating that flexibility to move it to a rural or less or suburban setting would show really good value of using that building. I think that's a really smart idea.
Can I just add something about kind of site development for affordable housing? I mean, largely affordable housing developers tend to be opportunistic in terms of the sites that they have available. They tend not to be able to compete in the market for the best sites. However, in an ideal world, you know, we're building mixed income, affordable housing adjacent to transit in fairly high density areas. And right now in Toronto, there are multiple sites where we have longer term plans to build, you know, very integrated, very comprehensive kind of city building objectives, including affordable housing. But they are vast, right? We have currently 17 sites, looking at a few more. I think there's an interesting role for the idea of using sites on a temporary basis whilst longer term plans unfold. And I think it speaks to, you know, whilst we want to expedite and make affordable housing delivery much quicker, there is a reality to some of the work that we're doing. Is, like I said, there's our high density complex sites often adjacent to transit, and we may not always be in control of some of the timelines associated with that. So this option of having something which is maybe less temporary and more just movable gives another layer to the options when you have a crisis in the city and a need for housing yesterday, while still being able to unfold larger city building objectives.
great. I do have a follow-up to that, maybe to help keep on this theme of the temporary, because it's such a fascinating subject. And I have that for Craig and Reese, who have experience on sort of the manufacturing project side. To operate a modular business, one has to feed the beast, so to speak. That's what we always hear, right? It's a manufacturing operation. The line has to continue. How do you manage maybe two different product types, or are they two different product types? You know, the usual throughput versus, say, a module that is temporary and could be relocated in the future or disassembled in the future. This goes to some of my previous sort of points about the migration of business, you know, that Dexterra's had to undertake, Reese, from being, you know, serving the oil and gas industry and continue to do that, but also now doing this housing and capability with NRB. I know, Craig, you used to be at Metric Modular, and you had that experience of producing high quality multifamily housing. When you are asked to pivot to a different product type, how does that impact that operation? How do you manage that as a manufacturer? Maybe start with Craig and then go to Reese, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. No, it can be difficult for sure. I think the idea of, and Ryan, you touched on it, is this flow through. I mean, you really want to treat the manufacturing facility like an automotive assembly line. You know, you don't want to have gaps in production. And so making sure that you do have that capacity to go from one project to the next is critically important. You don't want to have those downtimes. And so really that product mix really is crucial to the success of a modular manufacturer, and keeping that production line moving. Now, one of the hurdles here in Canada is just, you know, the scale and the timing of these projects doesn't always lend itself to production. And so you are having to fill gaps, and I'm sure Reese will touch on this too, but you have to keep this line moving. And so, you know, what I'd like to see, you know, here in Canada is, you know, can we get this industry to a size and scale where manufacturers thrive on, maybe it is one, maybe they are doing just one type of housing, or one type of product or typology, and that's where we're going to really see gains in the manufacturing process. But we're not there yet. I mean, Canada is, you know, it's a vast country and very fragmented, and from its urban centers, and so a lot of time we just don't have the manufacturing capacity to support that, and so you're having to fill in with various types of product mixes. But maybe I'll let Reese jump in here too, because he's probably saying a lot of the same things I am, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, the sorts of programs we're describing is kind of the utopia for the modular companies. You know, and the more that they can commit, the more that we can invest and grow and get better at what we do. Talking about the temporary, permanent, you know, in a way, that sort of standardized kit of parts, you know, suite libraries, standardized specifications can be quite similar across those product types. You know, we'd call it a double loaded corridor module with a studio unit either end of an open corridor that's connected on site. So if we can sort of standardize those and respond to the requirements of BC Housing or the City of Toronto or City of Vancouver across these programs and modify them, you know, they're not all exactly the same, but if we can modify them slightly, then we do reap the benefit of that from a production standpoint. So
we'll intersperse here. This is great. Ivan, you want to ask that question? It came up, and then we'll go back to the respondents.
Yeah, actually, this I think will keep it dynamic, and I know that, and actually maybe even we'll start this question with Abby, James, and Ryan, but we could also turn it to Marty, Mike, and Mary, because I think it's an interesting one that everyone is fascinated by, the financing of offsite construction. So, you know, I think now all of these are public programs, but just maybe for all of these programs, both BC, Vancouver, and Toronto, you know, how have there been challenges because it's a new technology in terms of financing, or because these are mostly public sector projects? Does that not come up in these projects? So maybe starting with James.
So BC Housing, we are in a unique position. So we're not actually part of the government. We're, as I mentioned, a Crown-owned corporation, and we're actually an accredited lender as well. So we can act as a bank. We provide interim and also arrange takeout financing for a lot of the products that we work on. So with the modular programs, we provided the interim financing for those and had to do our own kind of risk analysis and mitigation strategies around that. I would expect for any private lenders who would be funding some of these products would probably undertake kind of similar risk analysis and then have their own strategies as well. So for us, I think first off, trying to understand what the modular manufacturers and their cash flow requirements were for these products was key. We found that we weren't comfortable paying for any materials or raw materials, but the modules as they were being produced in the factory, we could make progress payments for those. And then once they're completed and still at the factory, we'd be comfortable advancing funds to help offset some of those costs. That included items like quite a few inspections of those units as they're being produced, bills of sale, offsite insurance. We actually used what we call our owner supplied insurance program. So as opposed to our manufacturers or construction partners getting the insurance for the project, we would actually place those policies and be able to take advantage of some of the scale there, and also tailor those policies to address our needs. And then ensuring that we do have a substantial amount of the scheduled values for those projects to then be associated with the actual on-site works, and then progress payments for those accordingly. So there was a bit of kind of risk analysis that was required, but we certainly found that it was something that was manageable.
That's great. And has similar experiences at municipal scale, Ryan, or in terms of financing, and was there some help with BC Housing actually kind of in some ways prototyping the financing as well as the technology?
Yeah, the TMH program was funded by BC Housing.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I don't have much more to add there. Yeah.
Great. And Abi, then moving to Toronto, and you've had experiences in sort of the West Coast sector. How is the financing situation different, similar?
Yeah, I would just maybe differentiate between funding and financing, because I think what you're talking about is two maybe different things. One involving a financial institution and they're managing their risk, versus a funder who's also managing risk around like project draws. The Rapid Housing Initiative, I think it's worth pointing out, is 100% capital funded program, almost unique, I think, in Canada. Certainly for the last 30 or 40 years, we haven't really seen a program like that, where at a national scale you're seeing that kind of investment, and that makes it much easier for us to do these kinds of projects. So I think it's worth saying that part of it also does make it easier to do things more quickly. But I do agree with James that there's still an element of risk. Like, that money comes to us at the City of Toronto, and we then take on the responsibility of making sure that what shows up on site is what we ordered, what we're expecting, and it is what our residents need. So we're still, doing inspections in the factory with our, chief building officer and their team. They're going out multiple times to the factory, and also making sure that the payments are drawn down appropriately. So there's still a part of that, but I've been doing some work with the Canadian Standards Association, and they're certainly hearing that when people are trying to do it on the market side, maybe not publicly funded, that there is a real variety of responses that they're getting from, banks and lending institutions, some of which they've been able to resolve. And it seems like it's coming down to the track record and kind of insurability of the actual modular providers, and the confidence that the banks or lending institutions have in what's happening in the factory. Because that's really what they want, is they want to be able to, if things go wrong, to be able to take the product in the factory as their asset, and what that means. So it's definitely interesting as we think about it from the private sector perspective.
Abi, I'm actually going to shift to Reese to ask that, but just have you noticed, though, from those conversations, is in the market sort of projects is there more confidence though in funding and financing modular because of the public work that's been going on and and the publicity that it's received?
It's an interesting question. You know, I think from recent conversations I've had, modular has definitely kind of turned a bit of a corner in people's understanding and psyche. But there are still definitely heard from at least two different private sector developers who are interested in doing modular, but they're still finding it hard to get over this issue about how you relate regular construction draws to something that's built in a factory and what that means and how they deal with it. And then heard from others who've like, yeah, no problem, we figured it out with our financial lenders. So I think it's changing, but it is about building that understanding about factory built offsite construction.
Great. Yeah, and so Reese, the industry perspective, both has working with these public kind of clients or municipal clients, or not their typical sort of market clients. Has that changed for NRB, the situation with funding and financing, and then vice versa? Have you noticed anything from these programs as in the industry? Is there more confidence now because of the strong public support for modular from that financing and funding side?
Yeah, I think Abi, you covered it so well. It's actually definitely the funding and the lender's comfort level is the same. Everyone wants to de-risk a project for sure. So from a manufacturer's point of view, we are building in our factory, not on site. Typically, lender gets comfort of QS turning up on site and approving and so there's new and more ways. What these programs have helped is creating these ways, creating these project examples and success stories that they have been funded, they have gone well. Lenders can go look at it, and the private sector will hopefully follow. That's why government investment is so important and so critical, to the growth of this industry. Is the private sector will look, get comfort, and follow. We've seen a lot of the hotel industry really embracing it. And from a US perspective, more and more lenders are actually, leaping on modular because they see the de-risk of a project. The certainty that modular has to offer, and actually, pursuing investment in modular programs. So, there's lots of good examples of that. So early days, but getting more and more comfortable. I mean, from my perspective, I work for a big company. We're backed by Fairfax Financial. We've got good resources, so it's easier. But we want the modular industry to grow with us. Smaller companies that don't have that comfort, what can we do to help them? Is it bonding? Is it bonding? Maybe some standardization across that program too. I know CMHC are looking at ways to standardize, which I think would be really important and a good thing for the industry too.
Great. Maybe we can. Sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to jump in a little bit.
Great.
With my finance background, when I started working with Rise Modular, I assumed that financing was going to be a huge barrier. And Rise has completed one small project and is just on the verge of completing a second project that it did with a third-party developer and contractor. And both of them were actually they're both privately funded market rate projects. And both of them were funded by a community bank in Minneapolis. And I was a little surprised to hear James say that they didn't get comfortable with funding materials. I was actually pleasantly surprised that this bank in the Twin Cities was comfortable that once the materials had arrived at the factory ready for installation, that they were willing to reimburse the manufacturer for those materials once that they were physically there and identified by barcodes, et cetera, for a particular project. The other thing that they did get comfortable with is similar to what James described of progress payments on a % completed basis on the individual modules. And this lender now has a really straightforward schedule of inspections that they come to the plant. And really, there have been virtually no hiccups with the financing disbursements on these two projects. It'll be interesting to see, because Rise has now been selected to be the manufacturer on a project which is being done by the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, which will start hopefully early in 2022. Ironically, they're waiting for being selected for capital funding. So the kind of the easy money hopefully will be awarded in December. But we're already talking with the Public Housing Authority about bringing potential investors in the low-income housing tax credits, which we use in the US to finance a lot of our multifamily housing, down to the plant later this fall so that they can see what it's like. So as they're assembling their bids on the tax credits, they'll do it knowledgeably. So it's, as Reese said, it's early days, but I've actually been very encouraged that lenders are showing a willingness to learn. And if there can be a partnership with the manufacturer to really show them the process, be transparent, be willing to do things like barcoding materials, that this may not be the stumbling block I thought it would be.
And we conducted this, the work going on in Minneapolis is really great, and it's really innovative and doesn't always get the attention that some of the startups that start or fail, referencing one of the questions in the chat, do in the media. And we conducted an interview with Juan Torres, who's overseeing that project, and we actually hope to get more info as that develops. But really, there's so much going on in this sort of policy regulatory framework space that really needs to be more attended to. Maybe to come back though to Mike. I know Mike has a few more questions. Mike Blanford, do you want to? What else or thoughts about the financing as well?
Oh, well, look, I'm an engineer. I don't want to touch the financing. That's fair enough. Fair enough. That's what we have. The other panelists for. Sure. Oh shoot, I've got a lot of questions, and there's not that much time. How about one of the, and I apologize in advance for not remembering which presentation it was, but one had, I think, some protesters talking about protesting NIMBYism and talking a little bit about that. And of course, in the US, some people don't want affordable housing in their backyard. But given that this is offsite construction, some people don't want offsite construction in their backyard. And my question was, to the panelists, how is modular housing perceived in Canada?
This is Ryan from the city of Vancouver. I don't think there's a lot of negative connotation with modular. That we see in a Vancouver side of things. I don't think it's we don't have a lot of production facilities though in Vancouver, just given the urban environment, but the actual use of it, I think it's almost indistinguishable from other forms of construction because they see folks would see the end product at that point. But
yeah. Oh, go ahead. In terms of the City of Toronto, I guess a few things to say regarding the perception, as you say, of modular housing. I agree. I think it's less about modular and unfortunately sometimes too much about the level of affordability or the people that we're serving through these homes and the kind of fear and stigma that exists around people experiencing homelessness or people who are on a lower income and what that could mean to potential changes in the character of your neighborhood or your property values. I think those are really kind of the nub of what it comes down to. I think the challenge that modular creates for those of us who are fully engaged in community engagement on these buildings and on these sites is the speed. So traditionally, with a traditional affordable housing building, we've got 6 months to kind of do that community engagement process. We go out, we show people what the building will look like. There's a round of comments that come back. We go out again in 3 months, and then we talk to the community again. in line with the rapid nature of some of these projects, we're taking what is sometimes a 6-month process and condensing that into 6 weeks. And so you get the immediate kind of shock factor of change coming to a neighborhood. And sometimes before people have really wrapped their head around what that change will mean and what it won't mean, and dispersing those myths, you're talking about a 6 to 8 week process, which is incredibly fast and adds to this kind of pressure cooker feel to some of that engagement. So I think it's not really the modular. I mean, we certainly did get questions about, are you just building, crappy housing for homeless people? We definitely got that question, but I think we were easily able to kind of burst those myths with the work that we've done. But it just is very fast, and that creates its own dynamic in communities when you're sometimes having these difficult conversations about how your neighborhood is changing, who is this housing for, who you want your city to be for, and who's ultimately going to live in these homes.
That's great. Anything else on the community engagement question? It's a good question.
Yeah, Ryan, if I may.
Yeah.
So, let me say that, as Ivan had pointed out, HUD has been engaged with off-site construction since early 1970s, in specific manufactured housing, which a lot of people think is analogous to modular. 15 years ago, I was involved in a survey where we sent out, got survey responses from 13,000 consumers asking them, what they felt about offsite construction, primarily comparing modular and manufactured housing. And of course, that was related to single family, which I think, causes its own problems. And as one of the panelists just mentioned, with multifamily housing, I think the end result is indistinguishable from a conventionally built from a conventionally built building, and you don't see the the size of the shape of the house or the slopes of the roofs, that lend themselves to, oh, that's a factory built single family home. And what we found in the research was that places that had a robust manufactured housing the respondents were more willing to accept modular. And of course, in places where there wasn't a robust manufactured housing industry, not only did they not want manufactured housing, but they also didn't want modular, basically for the same reasons, just because they felt that there was this, connotation that was substandard housing for, for poor people. Happy to share that report if anybody's interested.
Please.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the fact that I think Ryan Smith alluded to it, but that in the U.S. a lot of modular manufacturing grew out of the manufactured housing industry. In Canada, because of the nature of resource extraction, it's sort of workman's camps or relocatables were sort of a dominant market until fairly recently. So it seems those potential stigmas also are related to very different things, where you don't see necessarily those relocatables previously in cities. Your experience was different. So I think it's back to what we were also alluding to, which is really interesting to hear from Mike's research, is that it is, at the end of the day, a very cultural question, and how we have these conversations when it's just about technology, just about financing, just about business models. The real obstacles are often cultural, and the real opportunities are often cultural too. And that's something that really, whether we're looking at Sweden, Japan, Canada, or the US, those local nuances really make a huge difference in terms of the success of both public and market programs and projects.
Marty, did you want to ask another question, Marty Kooistra?
Sure. Let me just say a couple things on this last topic before we move on. Just to reinforce the challenges Abby's talking about, and when it comes down to permanent supportive housing, especially outside the urban core, in one community, we had 13 different public hearings to get a building sited. But we're doing this massive motel hotel acquisition strategy right now and converting those into permanent supportive housing. and it is really, really difficult in terms of public support. So I think, you know, the differences in product type and focus, you know, play a huge role in some of that public engagement. And timing is always an issue. People never have enough time to know about things. I want to go back to the culture piece. I was really intrigued in listening to the clarity that Craig and Reese and others brought to this need, and James, of teams and packaging TA support, you know, and really trying to work on getting the delivery culture well established. You know, the way publicly funded affordable housing in our market happens, every time we do a project, there's, generally speaking, a new architect, a new GC. The teams are constantly remolded. Some of that is just due to law related to procurement around public funding. And we find that it is a direct contradiction to what you are talking about with the clean baton handoffs, empowering people down the line to make decisions, and all of that clarity that you described. And I'm just wondering if folks have additional thoughts about that.
Well, maybe I'll jump in, Marty, and I'll let the others chime in as well. I think one of the advantages of, you know, the programs that Toronto and Vancouver have embarked on is really looking at this as a portfolio with one provider. So this is where the speed to market comes in, because the ability to just build one project with one project team and the lessons learned from that, often that after that one project, all the parties go their own separate ways. And I think this is one of the advantages of a program delivery model where you're procuring a number of homes over a set period of time with the same project team, and that comfort level and the culture that's created during that during that program really leads to a lot of that accelerated delivery. You know, once you've kind of gone through one one particular site, well, the next time you're immediately going to get better at, you know, whether it's the design or the engineering, but also just the comfort level with your other fellow members around the table. And I think that's where modular thrives, is that, you know, replicability of not only the product itself, but also the replicability of the culture that is formed under a certain program. And I'm sure, you know, whether it's Ryan or, you know, James or Abby, they're probably noticing that their delivery timelines keep getting shorter and shorter because, you know, from one project to the next, they're getting better and better and better. And so I think that's one of the big lessons learned that I've taken away from these housing programs, is that the overall delivery gets shortened, but not just because of the, you know, the form and function of the building itself. It's the team approach too. So maybe Reese can chime in on that as well.
Yeah, I'd just quickly add, from a modular industry perspective, there is also still the chance and push for standardization within the industry too, because there's still, you know, every factory does it slightly differently, you know, which doesn't necessarily help for scalable programs, you know, with what the Housing Development Consortium is trying to do. So there is an opportunity for standardization within the industry too. Standard details, we talked about contracts, you know, standardized contracts. You know, that's something else. It's not just the housing providers to create their sort of kit of parts.
To add to that too, the team, it's also broadly, if you think about the regulatory end, having a very consistent team around your permitting and approvals. We've done that here at the City of Vancouver, so that when those projects come in, they're very familiar with what the project looks like. There's a replicable design that they're familiar to seeing, and that makes the approval process that much faster as well.
That's great, thank you. Good question, Marty. Mary, before we go to yours, can we pick up on this point that Ryan Bigelow just mentioned about permitting and inspections? We have a question from the audience related to that. in the US, we have the situation where every authority having jurisdiction, every municipality, every government group that has authority for that particular project, adopts a national sort of standard, the International Building Code or International Residential Code. Canada is a very similar process, but what that leads to in the US is some municipalities are enlightened with regards to modular, and some are just not at all, and therefore there can be varying barriers. It's very difficult for then project teams, these collaborative teams we're talking about, and the manufacturers to strategically approach markets and know how to operate in those markets to meet the needs of that local jurisdiction. In your particular programs you've talked about, James, Abby, and Ryan, there was a discussion about sort of expedited permits and inspections related to this that went hand in hand with the fast track process of using modular as opposed to a traditional build. I think Abby, you mentioned that in particular. Could any of you, and I think Ryan, you had a point on your, I can't remember what it was called, the program that allowed for that to happen. Maybe the two of you could talk about it, and then James, if you want to pick up on that as well, it would be really informative for our US audience as we're trying to navigate jurisdictions.
Well, maybe I'll just mention a couple of things. So I think because you're talking a little bit about two different things. One is kind of speed of approvals, which relates to the process the organization has, the municipality has for approvals. And I think irrespective of modular, many of us are dealing with pressure to shorten those timelines around especially affordable housing to respond to the crisis and context that we're operating in. So the City of Toronto, like other municipalities, has a program for reducing timelines around affordable housing delivery. Ours in particular is called Concept to Keys. So there is a separate team that operates to facilitate and project manage approvals in relation to certain types of projects. But I think the other piece is around the degree of confidence that the professional staff at a municipal level will have in relation to the factory and the quality of work. And certainly a big step in both of building that confidence starts at the top. So it was about taking the leadership, I think for both Vancouver and Toronto out, taking the chief building officer to the factory to have a look, and so that they could ask their questions and see the quality of the work that was underway. And from that flows a process and an approval and inspection process that is coming from a place of confidence. And certainly I remember the factory tour with the chief building officer in Toronto, and he commented on the quality of work that he was seeing, and in fact said that it was far superior to what he often sees on site in terms of framing, for example. So I think starting at the top, and then from that, he then set up a process of inspections with his team that relates to each individual project that's been really successful.
Maybe to build on that too, we've got a similar program in Vancouver, similar to that Concept to Keys. We call it a short program. We're really looking end-to-end process improvements for our permitting, both not just the process, but the systems and the people involved and the decision-making authority that's involved there. So, and that's resulted in some continuous improvement in shrinking our permitting times. We've related to modular though, yeah, like you got to walk before you run sometimes, right? And this is where our 220 terminal pilot, it helped build some of that education and awareness and understanding of how this product is built. And from there, having repeated projects within our TMH program that are very similar, it allows our permitting team to get into a lot more detail one after another and build their experience and knowledge and comfort with this form of construction. So it's and then the consistency in teams on our permitting side was something that we thought was really, really beneficial. So every time a modular type project comes in, there's that subject matter expertise to draw from within the organization or within the city.
I think for us, for our programs, we're very kind of fortunate to have that provincial sponsorship of the programs. In British Columbia, we have the Municipal Act that delegates authority to your municipalities or counties around permitting. But the province had actually pulled back on allowing those individual municipalities to have their own kind of add-ons to the code and that sort of stuff, with exception to Vancouver, because they're a little bit different than everywhere else in the province. So it certainly made it a lot easier for us for all the different projects that were being deployed throughout the entire province, not having to have a different code for each of them that we're complying with. But that being said, every single planning department had their questions. They had aspects of modular construction and inspections that they needed to understand, and so for us, being able to make those connections and tell the planning department in Richmond, hey, go talk to the folks in Vancouver, and we'll even set up that meeting so you can get that understanding, was absolutely key. I don't think it's very often that we tell planning departments, hey, maybe you should go talk to this other planning department, because they're going to be able to help you through that as well. The other key piece just with that question was, having a specific code for modular. That's not something that we have done or we're looking to do. All of the modular projects, we consider them to have to meet our standardized codes, and really an in situ built building or a factory built building should be of the exact same quality. However, what we have done is we have our construction guidelines and our kind of recommendations in terms of material specs and quality and that sort of thing. And we've recognized that the way buildings are constructed in the factory settings is a little bit different, and there's some really great aspects that you should be able to take advantage of to even actually enhance the quality. And so we actually have published separate modular construction guidelines just around those quality aspects, and in turn you end up getting probably a product that's more suited for factory construction as opposed to in situ.
Mary, we're going to give you the last question or comment here, and then we're going to close out the webinar. So Mary Tingerthal, yeah, do you have one more question or one more comment, please?
Yes, and I'd like to ask this of Ryan, James, and Abby. We heard from Reese and from Craig, really the importance of predictability of program funding being available that can be used to build modular projects. And I know from our experience in the US so far that it is this certainty of knowing that if you're going to build a factory, if you're really going to invest in teams and a process, that you're not going to do it if you know that maybe you're going to get funding for one project. So I'd ask you to look in your crystal balls and tell me, how likely do you think it is that committed funding for modular construction will exist far into the future in each of your venues?
Okay, well, I'm going to get my crystal ball out first, Mary. We agree at the City of Toronto that predictable funding around affordable housing is probably one of the things that could make the biggest difference around a sustained housing supply, be it modular or other. And it's been incredibly elusive, unfortunately, in a Canadian context. We are in the midst of an election right now, and I think what is noticeable is the degree of commonality and commitment to housing supply across all parties right now. And I think that's, for many of us, the first time that we've seen that actually across the full spectrum. So I think that we will see a focus on the support for housing supply into the future. Exactly what that looks like, I don't think it's possible to say, but the degree of success I think that we've had over the last few years on delivering housing and responding to this the crisis and context that we're operating with modular, with acquisition strategy, etc., is incredibly attractive to all levels of governments, whose politicians enjoy groundbreakings and building openings and all of the attributes that go with successful housing supply. So I think it is here to stay in some format, although I wish, like you, that it was, announcement of a 5-year program rather than a 1-year, quick stop program. But I think the focus on housing supply is here for the foreseeable future.
Thank you.
For BC Housing, we've been doing specific modular programs for over a decade now. So if I look at the past as an indicator of the future, I would probably say yes. But what I am seeing more of is that for our modular initiatives, we basically see it coming from two directions. You have the programs that we're implementing, and then you have the projects that we're funding. And I see those as really the two streams where modular, is coming to fruition. So with those programs, are we going to have kind of bespoke programs that say, well, we want to do modular construction for them? Probably yes. Those are absolutely going to have to be driven from the objectives. So whether it be, the levels of affordability or the housing typology and those sorts of things, that's going to drive the decision whether modular is best suited for for that objective or not from our end. In terms of it coming from the projects, from the private sector, from the nonprofit housing sector, from those co-op sectors, they're certainly seeing those successes from those programs and saying, hey, I want to do some of that too. And so we're seeing more and more of that where, groups are saying there's a huge amount of benefit here for our specific project. Let's take those lessons learned that have been implemented by the federal, provincial, or municipal governments on modular, and we're going to apply that to our specific projects and to our specific tenant demographics and that sort of thing. So I say yes, but it's more, we're going to see more from the project side as opposed to us, specifically saying we're doing a modular program as well.
Maybe on a local government scale in Vancouver, we're fully dependent on the province and federal government to fund new social housing projects, but we do continue to make investments in making land available for social housing, which would be potentially suitable for future modular construction. But so this is more of an advocacy piece to BC Housing. I would love to see more and more commitment in social housing investment, and but the past has been very good with their support in the programs we mentioned, be it the pilot, the TMH program, and now permanent supportive housing.
Well, thanks a lot for sharing that, because it's not too dissimilar from the way I see things unfolding in the US, that it really is driven by where our state and national governmental organizations see the need for housing that can justify a public dollar commitment. And that tends to be around particular populations, solving homelessness, permanent supportive housing, those sorts of things. And what's interesting to me in your examples is that you have chosen at the provincial and local level to really embed modular within those programs as encouragement, as pilot programs, et cetera. And I do think it is the intersection of those two streams of thought that will begin to provide some of that predictability that will allow the manufacturers and the developers to say it's worth learning about modular, and because we know that there will be funding into the future.
Well said, Mary. Thank you. It's great. Ivan, you want to close this with some slides, and then we'll thank our guests for coming.
Well, again, we really appreciate everyone who's been involved, and you know, we're looking forward to also next month, where unfortunately due to COVID, we have decided not to do a live event in California, but we are working with our partners in California to bring a similar format in terms of pre-recorded deep dives and then a webinar where we can really have a discussion. We haven't finalized the date, but the week of October 18th, so about a month from now, we're hoping to go to sunny California and see where really one of the hottest and most challenging housing markets in the US, how is it deploying offsite construction, and we'll be working with companies like Factory OS, Connect Homes, Silver Creek, as well as the Turner Center at Berkeley is really a kind of research partner. So we'll stay tuned to the ModX site, and hopefully we will also, we're really trying to refine this this format so we can really both have good content, but also have the time to unpack it. And then in November, we're going to be bringing a new kind of exec ed experience, similar to what we've done in the past in states like Washington State and in Minnesota. Now we're looking a little bit towards the future, maybe to some global best practices. So this will be a 6-week course that we're preparing in November, and it will hopefully be running every quarter, which takes a look at some of the sort of what are established, but also future trends in offsite. So those are just some things that are coming from ModX. But I'm going to throw it back to Ryan to close the webinar today.
I've learned a lot on this webinar. I really have, and it's exciting to see what Canada is doing. I want to thank Abi Bond from City of Toronto, James Forsyth from BC Housing, and Ryan Bigelow from VAHA, Vancouver Affordable Housing Agency, and City of Vancouver for their time. Reese Kane from NRB and Craig Mitchell from Black Box. I want to thank all of our Canadian partners for their willingness to do the interviews. First of all, that took time and preparation, and we know and we thank you for that. And then to come on here and be part of the webinar. And then to our respondents, Mike Blanford, Marty Kooistra, Mary Tingerthal, Mike from HUD, Marty from Housing Development Consortium, and Mary from Construction Revolution and her consultancy Tingerthal Group. I want to thank Ivan for questions in our audience, for the great questions that helped to frame a lot of this discussion today. You will find the recording on the ModX website. We will also be posting to LinkedIn. And then if you were registered for this event as an attendee, we'll share that link directly in an email. Thank you for coming and participating in ModX Canada, and have a good Friday.
And see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan.
Bye.
Thanks, Ivan.
Bye.